Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Neville and welcome to Selective Imagery. I started taking pictures when I was 7 or 8 years old, and I really shoot just about everything. And here's some samples of what I take, whether it be sunrises, alligators, birds. It's what I do a lot of right now. But I also do macro. I'll do small animals, and I'll do street photography, and I'll use my old cameras to take some black and white photos with. So here's a sample of one of my cameras coming up. So I'm a generalist, but right now I'm focused a lot on wildlife and birds in particular. So I hope you enjoy my channel, and let's get right to the show. Welcome to Thanks for the Memories, Part 7. Well, hello everyone. This is Jeff Neville for Selective Imagery. So we're going to talk about 3 vintage cameras today. And you know how I like to talk. Sometimes it's a little too much. But we're going to talk about the Voigtlander Bessa. It's a 6x9 medium format camera made from 1929 to 1956. We're also going to talk about a little mystery camera in this nice brown leather case made in Germany, hint hint, with nice chrome accents on it. Very nice looking case. We will hold off on revealing what that camera is right at the moment. And then lastly, we have the infamous Nikon FM3A, a highly desirable collector camera. I mean, it's been driven artificially high, but there are some good reasons for that. So we're going to talk about this camera along with the associated MD-12 motor drive that I bought along with it. And this is a prime example of a really special Nikon body. So I'm going to move some of these other cameras out of the way. We're going to focus on the mystery camera and talk about that first, and we'll be right back. Okay, so we're going to look at this Kodak Retinette 1A 35mm viewfinder camera. It's not a rangefinder camera. It's just a viewfinder camera, and we'll explain the difference in a little bit. This was made in the States. It was made in Germany, and it was in the States from 1959 to I believe 1965, 1966 time frame. So it's a relative of the German-made Kodak Retina folding camera, which was actually a very good camera. You could find them on eBay. It's hard to find a good one though. So this was a cheaper version made for mom and pop to take pics of their kids. Vacations. Was considered to be a very well made camera. The cost was like $45. So when you look at the front of the camera and you look below the lens, you see this little tang. This little plastic tang. Okay, that was just used to stand the camera up. And then if you had a threaded cable release, you could hook it up to the top of the shutter release button, set your camera up on a table, take a picture with the cable release. Now, just above that tang, you have a lever with a red dot on it. And that is very common on cameras for decades that had these lever type mechanical self timers, is they would have a red dot on them because sometimes you had multiple levers. You might have a shutter cocking lever that looked similar in a different location, and just so people wouldn't get confused, they put the red dot on the self timer. So basically if I cock that over towards the shutter release, push the shutter, there you go. Nice and quiet, works perfect. So the next thing you see on the front of this camera is a knurled area around the front of the lens, and that rotates, and it's zone focusing. Okay, you don't have through the lens focusing, it's zone focusing. So you have to have a pretty good idea of how far away your subject is from your camera. And you have detents. Okay, this thing is labeled everywhere from 1 meter, to infinity. Okay, and it has detent stops on it that are basically set for 6.5, 10, and 30 feet. So the next knurled ring is this larger one here that's knurled, and that's to adjust your shutter speed. So I don't know if you could see it here in the image, if you could see the shutter speed numbers, which are B for bulb mode, and 1/30th, 1/60th, 1/125th, and 1/250th of a second. And it is a leaf type shutter. The leaf shutter is in the lens. It's very quiet. Okay, and then you have an adjustment closest to the camera where you have this tang that sticks out just on one side, and that's for your f-stops. So it makes it easier to adjust your f-stops, which are f2.8 to f22. And then you have your PC sync for your flash. Now if you look at the top of the camera, you have your count down film counter. So you have to rotate the knob, okay, to set the number for whatever amount of exposures you have on that roll of film, 24, 30, 36, what have you. And you set that, and then as you advance the film, it actually goes down to 0. You have your shutter release, you have your cold shoe, you have your rewind knob, and that's basically all that knob does. There's an arrow that shows you to rotate it basically clockwise, the way I'm doing it right now. And it has just like some film reminder information so that you can you can adjust for what type of film that you have in the camera, and it's just a visual indicator. Is it color film with flash? Is it color film in the sun? Is it black and white film? And that's all that does. It doesn't physically change anything in the camera. Now what's interesting is the bottom of the camera. Your film advance lever is on the bottom versus a typical camera where it would be on the top. It actuates and advances the film very easily. I don't see that getting broken unless someone wants to be a brute with it. You have this release button that you push in when you need to rewind your film. You push that button in and you turn the rewind on the top of the camera. You also have your tripod mount, and then you have a small pin sticking up here, and when you depress the pin, the back of the camera opens up, and there you go. You got your pressure plate, your guide rails, really nothing different than what you have in most other cameras. You have the small viewfinder that you look through. But when you look through the viewfinder window, you're just going to see a frame line that includes a parallax correction marker at the top that you utilize when you're shooting close-up. It has no other information. There's no exposure meter. You have to use a handheld meter. And that's it for this camera. But it's I picked this up for $35 at a flea market. And it's basically in EX plus condition. It's really, really nice. I've seen these in much worse condition, people trying to get $75 or more on eBay. So I got a steal on this, and the case is in perfect shape as well, so I'm very, very pleased. So we'll move on to the next camera. Hey guys, I just realized that when I was talking about the Kodak Retinette in the beginning, I said it was a viewfinder camera and not a rangefinder camera, and that I would just explain the difference later on, which I failed to do, so I'm going to correct that error. A viewfinder camera is basically just what it sounds like. You look through the viewfinder and you have frame lines, and that's it. You have no other information. You have no focusing aid. That's all you have, is something to frame your image, and that is a viewfinder camera. Okay, with a rangefinder camera, instead of using zone focusing, what you would have is, when you look through the viewfinder, and this is if it's a coupled rangefinder camera, you would look through the viewfinder and you would basically have either a colored dot, a colored square, a colored triangle, and your image would be split. If your image was not in focus, it would look like it's split in half, and when you adjusted your focus wheel, you would bring it so the images match up with each other and form one image, and that's how you know it's in focus. So that is the difference between a viewfinder camera and a rangefinder camera. So just wanted to correct an error that I forgot to go back to that and discuss it, and that's that. So here we are going to talk about camera number 2, which is the Voigtlander Bessa. It's a 6x9 medium format camera made between 1929 and 1956. Now, I cannot ascertain what year my model is. I looked at the serial number that's on the back of the lens when you look at the camera back, and that would tend to make it look like it was built in 1949, but then I saw some cameras that were basically in someone else's collection, had the same brand lens but a different focal length, that were from the 1930s. So I'm a little unsure about when this particular model was made. I have to do some more research on it, but it is hard to find out. Now, when I bought this, it had some loose leatherette on it that I re-glued. It's not in perfect shape, but it's in decent shape, and I believe it is in working condition once I cleaned it up. And you get 8 images out of this camera from a roll of 120 film. So to open up the bellows, which is right here, you got this release button right here. You depress that and just kind of pull, and it will open up. And there we go. Now, on this particular camera, the bellows are fixed. It's not like on a rail system where you can slide it out further that you might have in some cameras from the 1920, like Zeiss Icon bellows cameras. You could pull those out quite a ways, and you actually move them back and forth to adjust your focus that way. Now, what makes this camera kind of interesting is it's a zone focusing system, similar to what we talked about on the other camera. Now, you have a little foot here on this back plate that you can pull down, or excuse me, lift out, and that once again allows you to stand the camera up. And you do have a threaded cable release right here. Okay, I do not have a cable release for it. They're not too hard to find. Now, you have a metal lever here. I'm going to show you the bottom. This metal lever, you use either your thumb, typically you use your thumb, and you push it in that direction, and that'll trip the shutter. Now, this particular camera, this lens, it's a scope R f3.5, and it'll say 10.5 centimeters, which is basically a 105 millimeter lens. And just like the other camera, below the lens, may be hard to see, right here, you have a lever. That's your self timer, has the red dot on it. Okay. Above the lens element is a knurled ring on the outside, similar to the other camera, where you adjust your shutter speeds. Okay. And if you look at the plate here on the top, the designations closest to the front of the lens is your shutter speed scale, and then you have another sliding lever right here, and there's another set of numbers which are your f-stops. So your f-stop values are from f3.5 to f22, and your shutter speeds, you don't have a lot of selections on these cameras. You have time mode, bulb mode, and basically 1 second to 1/200th of a second. Okay. Now, what's neat on the zone focusing is it has two symbols on it, which is really, really neat. And one symbol is like a upside down triangle, and another symbol is a circle. And if you look at the back of the camera, and you have a data plate that talks about depth of field. And, oops, losing it here. At the very bottom of the plate, it says F8 and shows the upside down triangle, and it says if you set your camera for F8, you're good from 8 to 15 feet for your focusing. If you turn the focus ring to the circle, you're good from 20 feet to infinity. So those are like quick settings for you on this camera. Now, any other setting that you might want to do is all defined in this table, which is pretty self-explanatory. So this lever on the top is your shutter cocking mechanism. So, you know, once you set your focus range and you cock your shutter, okay. If you're doing when you go to take your picture, you have this lift up, flip up viewfinder system that has lenses in it. Okay. So horizontally, you know, you would look through in this direction. Vertically, you would hold it in this direction. Frame your subject, okay, and move the lever, take your picture. Simple as that. Recock your, you would then advance your film with this lever on the side, and your film number is going to show up in the back, okay? So you know whether you're on. Like I said, you could take I think 8 images on a roll of 120 film, as I said with this camera. So you take the shot, you advance the film, recock the shutter, line everybody up, take your picture. And just to show you that the self timer works, here we go. And that's it, and that works. So the camera is fully functional. The lens is in good shape. Okay, I'm just going to fold the viewfinder down. And let's see if I have any other information. They call this your framing eye level sports finder. And let's see. And that's really about it. When you're done taking pictures, you push this lever on the front. It's going to be hard for me to do it, not really looking. Okay, you push it in and you fold up the camera. And that's it. And this was meant to be able to go in your pocket. Okay, and they made a lot of different Bessa models over the years. I mean, you know, some that look completely different than this in the 50s and 60s. But this was considered a pocket camera, obviously your coat pocket type of camera. But it is a neat camera, and it is a 6:9 format. And you know, you could use this camera right now, and obviously with these types of cameras, you did not have, you know, you had the zone focusing, and that's what you relied on. You did not have an exposure meter. You had to use a manual exposure meter. But you know, that was the case for cameras for many decades, where you did not have light meters built into them. And on some of these old fold-out cameras, certain models, certain brand cameras, believe it or not, at some point actually put in range finders inside of them for focusing, which dramatically improved focusing because you weren't guessing how far away your subject was and using the zone focusing system. So there were actually some models of cameras, even in the 30s, excuse me, that actually had rangefinder focusing in them. So that's about it for this camera. I mean, it's just a nice collectible camera. It's not big. You got your tripod socket here on the bottom, and I love the data plate. I mean, that provides you with all the information you need for what your focusing capabilities are at a given f-stop. Really nice little handle. And that's that. And we're going to move on to the last camera. Okay, here we are with the last camera we're going to talk about. And we got a little backstory and history. This is the Nikon FM3A, and this is a near mint condition example of this camera, which is really hard to find one that's in good shape. And this thing is immaculate. I mean, I'm not necessarily happy with what I paid for it, but I'm happy with what I got for the money. So I have on this camera right now a Nikon 105mm f3.5, and this is an AI lens, which stands for aperture indexing lens. And then next to it we have what came with it is a Nikon MD-12 motor drive that I bought with it, and this takes 8 AA batteries, believe it or not. I mean, you look at it and you say, gee, that really isn't that big. There's 8 batteries in there? Yeah, there's 8 batteries in there. So until we talk about this, I'm going to just kind of put this to the side for now. And we're going to, no pun intended, focus on the camera. Now, in the storyline behind this camera was in the mid-1990s, you had a fair amount of photographers, they were demanding a high quality manual focus alternative to the autofocus cameras that were present at that time, since the amateur consumer versions were not known for being overly robust. I mean, the autofocus cameras at that time, unless you bought a real high-end model, reliability wasn't that good. So there were people that said, I just want a mechanical camera. I want something that's going to last me for decades. And the design of this FM3A was very expensive, and it was never made to appeal to really your average consumer. I mean, the marketing and its intended audience was serious amateurs and professionals who wanted a quality camera that could last for decades, which this one has. And this camera was manufactured from 2001 to 2006. Now that seems a bit odd because digital imaging was becoming commonplace within that window of time, and the Nikon D100 digital camera was introduced in 2002. So this came out in 2001, and then the Nikon D100 came out in 2002. Kind of interesting. Now, although the FM3A sales were fairly steady, once those digital cameras got introduced, it basically ate away at the market for conventional SLRs. But for many, the FM3A is considered one of the best manual focus SLRs ever made. And I'm talking even comparing it to some of Nikon's professional cameras. Now I'm going to rattle off a bunch of specs which will put you to sleep, but it'll give you an understanding why this camera is desirable, why collectors want this camera, why people that like to shoot pictures want this camera, and then we'll get into just the basic features of the camera itself. But the specs, it had what was called a copper silumen alloy body, and I never heard the term silumen before, and that basically the body is made out of silicone and aluminum. Don't ask me any more than that. That's that's what I found out. And it is fully manual mode, has fully manual modes, and it also has aperture priority. It has very accurate match needle exposure control. It has TTL compatible or TTL capable off the film electronic flash system. The film transport mechanism, it's made of hardened gears and moving parts mounted on ball bearings. Has a vertical metal shutter that uses aluminum alloy blades and oilless self-lubricating bearings, and is a hybrid electromechanically controlled shutter. And that's what added a lot of cost to this shutter because of the size of this camera. It's pretty darn close to an Olympus OM1. And to fit a hybrid shutter system into a camera body this size was totally unheard of, and that's what added a lot of cost to this camera back in the day. It has stainless steel guide rails, titanium mirror. It uses 60/40 center weighted silicone photodiode light meter concentrated on a 12 millimeter diameter circle when you look through the viewfinder. It has the available motor drive, the MD12, which we have right here, which can give you 3.2 frames per second. Yes, it's not 20 frames a second, people. Don't pass out. It has what they call the standard K3 type focusing screen, which was a split prism image microprism type with a clear matte screen, version 2. And when you look through the viewfinder, you have all the information you need. You have the shutter speeds on the left-hand side, You have an exposure compensation indicator that lights up if you have your exposure compensation enabled. You have obviously you have a separate needle that moves for your exposure. You have the shutter indication. You have direct aperture value, so as you adjust your aperture, you can see what your aperture is in the viewfinder. And then you have a flash ready light, which is the kind of like so much the standard lightning bolt insignia. And when it's a solid color, then your flash is ready to fire. If it's blinking, then your flash is not ready to take a shot again until it turns into a solid color. The EV range is 1 to 20 at ISO 100 with a 50mm f1.4 lens. It has exposure compensation, plus or minus 2 EV in 1/3 stop increments. It has shutter speeds in aperture priority mode are electronic, steplessly controlled from 8 seconds to 1/4000th of a second. In manual mode, you have bulb and 1 second to 1/4000th of a second. Viewfinder magnification is 0.83 with a 50mm lens set to infinity, 93% coverage. You have a depth of field preview lever versus a depth of field preview button, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. You have a very large pressure plate on the back door to make sure that film is perfectly flat against the rails to help achieve optimum sharpness in your images. You have a auto DX mode for anywhere from ISO 25 to 5000, or you have manual selection capability from ISO 12 to 6400. You've got an AE lock button. You have a TTL flash compatible X sync, less than 1/250th of a second. A PC sync terminal, standard hot shoe. You can do multiple exposures. And the camera size is 5.6 inches wide, 3.54 high, and 2.28 inches deep. Weighs 20.1 ounces, 1.25 pounds. And the price with the chrome body was $820 when it came out, and this is the black version. And as you know, the black versions, although you get the brassing look after a while, which some people like, the black versions are always a fair bit more money. So this camera basically merged the robustness of the mechanical FM2N with the electronic aperture control of the FE2. Nikon had 2 series of camera bodies, one that was purely mechanical and one that offered aperture priority. And this was the first one where they looked at both those model styles and they combined it into this one camera. What makes this camera great is, yes, it has a battery. It uses the battery for your exposure meter. But if the battery dies, you can shoot fully mechanical mode and use all the shutter speeds with a dead battery. You know, you'd have to have a handheld exposure meter, but you're not limited as you were on many camera bodies to where if the battery died, you're dead in the water. You can't take a picture. If you were lucky, you might have had a camera where if the battery died, it would default to one shutter speed option, which was typically a low shutter speed, and you were able to use the camera with that one shutter speed. So that's what makes this one stand out of the crowd, along with the build quality. The build quality is just exceptional. The hybrid shutter was, like I said, a major engineering challenge to make one small enough to fit in this body. And when you're in aperture priority mode, the shutter is electronically controlled, and then it reverts to mechanical control when you're in manual mode. These cameras actually sell for higher prices than when they did when they were brand new. And they're valued by collectors, and because people want these, because of that, some of the uniqueness of this camera has driven the prices up on these cameras quite a bit. Now, some people want to compare this camera to like a Pro F3 body. They're thinking, oh, you know, FM3A, that must be like the baby of the F3, which it makes no sense because the F3 came out in 1980. This came out in 2001. So actually the F5 was the Pro body that was available at that time when this camera was manufactured. And I would argue this camera is better than the F3 personally for most people. Now the F3 has impressive specs, some features that aren't in this camera, but if the battery dies it can only shoot at 1/60th of a second shutter speed, and it only has a shutter speed maximum of 1/2000th of a second versus 1/4000th of a second. So the main perk of the professional camera was you had a wide assortment of specialty viewfinders and focusing screens, whereas the FM3A, you can change the focusing screen with a special tool from the front, but they only have 3 types. But for most people, those 3 types are more than enough. So let's just look at the camera a little bit closer, and hopefully you can see what I'm pointing to here. You have your mechanical self-timer. You have a lever right here, which is your depth of field preview lever instead of a button on the side that you have on a lot of other cameras. When you look at the other side here, you have your lens release button. You have a small button here on the side. What this button is, this is for when you're using your flash. If you push this button and hold it in place, it'll basically knock down your flash down -1 EV. So sometimes you get those situations where the flash, not like a mirrorless camera where you can see the result and knock the power down on your flash, but sometimes you just kind of know that. Usually from having used the flash already, you may say, well, certain circumstances my flash is a little bit brighter than I want it to be. You could just hold this button in and you can knock it down -1 EV. And then this has a cover on it, but this is your flash sync right here. Now on the, we'll do the bottom of the camera next, I guess. You have the button that you push in when you get to the end of the roll of film, so you can rewind. You have your tripod socket, you have your battery compartment, and you have your mechanical connection point and your electrical connection point for your motor drive. And when you look at the top, okay, you have your shutter release, and when you push halfway down is when you see the metering system kick in. And you have shutter, you have B and 1 second to 1/4000th of a second, and then you have a green letter A for aperture priority, and you have a release button in the middle of this knob. And when you have it in A mode, this knob is locked so you don't accidentally bump it and get out of aperture priority. And to get out of aperture priority, you have to push this button down and rotate the dial. You have your film advance lever. And what's interesting about the film advance lever is when it's pushed all the way in towards the front of the body, you cannot accidentally take a picture, and your metering system doesn't work, so you're saving your battery. When you flip out your film advance lever, at this point you can push the button down halfway, you could do your metering. Okay, so when you're actually taking pictures, your default position for your advance lever is the way you see it here. Okay, that's what it's going to look like. So you advance the film, take the picture. Now you also have a small lever right here. When you pull that lever, and hold it. You pull it towards the back of the camera and you hold it. You can advance your film. Well, you can advance the shutter cock. You cock the shutter, but it doesn't advance the film, and that's how you take a multiple exposure. You pull this lever in this direction as you're advancing, as you think you're advancing the film, but you're not really advancing the film, you're just cocking the shutter. Because basically, your film advance lever does two things. It advances your film, typically, and it cocks your shutter. Excuse me, cocks your shutter. Now, you got your hot shoe. You have your rewind lever for your film. You have this knob that when you lift it up, you can adjust your ISO range for your film. And you can also set it for DX mode, where it automatically reads a DX coded film canister. And then you have a button here that you push, and when you rotate the knob, that's where you adjust your exposure compensation. So we will pull down the self timer. And there you go. Works perfect. You want to look at the inside of the camera. You lift up like you do on all the older cameras, and you have your window to see your film type, and you have a huge pressure plate to hold that film very, very tightly on the guide rails, and you have your metal shutter. You have contacts over here for a data back. And you have your, I don't know if you could see them, I'll try to hold the camera. You have contacts in here to read your DX canister, film canister. And you have very, very high quality parts in the back of that camera. When you look at the back, the only other thing you have that I haven't talked about, there's a very, very small button here for your auto exposure lock button. And you have center weighted metering in the camera. So basically, your primary subject, what you want to have exposed properly, you're going to put them in the middle of the frame. And then what you can do is hold down this auto exposure lock, recompose, and take the picture. And that way, all your camera settings are based on giving you the right exposure, let's say of the person sitting at a table, and the lighting is a little bit different behind the person or to the right of the person. Expose for the person, lock in your auto exposure, recompose, take the image. Now, I'm going to put the motor drive on this. Okay, it's really easy to go on. I have a cover here for, hooking up probably a wired shutter release. You look at the top. You have a button that allows you to turn this knob either into single shot mode or continuous mode. And then at the bottom you have, a tripod mount, of course, because you're going to cover up the one that's on the bottom of the camera. And you have your electrical contacts here. And you have your mechanical connection there. And then this is just a small pin that sticks up like an alignment pin. So you may or may not be able to see me do this because of how my camera is set up filming here. Takes a while to get it on, but you know, it does make the camera a little bit bigger. But it's got a good grip. And we're in single mode right now. And you turn on the, you turn it on. There you go. When you're using the motor drive, I forgot, you have to have the lever pushed all the way in. You don't have it out at all, or it thinks you're going to manually advance it. So this is what it sounds like for a single. We change it to continuous mode. And that sounds beautiful. So that's pretty much it. I mean, that's the history of the camera. If you're a collector or you just want to have one of the best mechanical cameras ever made, I mean, this is right up there with the, you know, the Leica SLRs. The manual ones that were made before they kind of like went in bed with Minolta. They developed the electronics for them, but this is right up there in terms of the quality level, and the black body is just simply gorgeous, and I love this thing. So, as I say, enjoy life, get out and capture it, no matter what camera you use. It's all about you will understanding the tool that you choose to use, and whether the tool is 50 years old or 80 years old or 5 years old, it doesn't matter. You try to learn the tool that you're going to use as best you can, and you could get phenomenal results, and people base the results on what your picture looks like. And hopefully you make prints of your pictures, or you make books. I always harp on, make some photo books, because when I'm long gone, if I have photos in a photo album, I'll guarantee you they're all going to get thrown away. If I have photos that I've turned into a photo book, my children might actually hang on to them because they're not going to take up a lot of room in the closet. So that's how I look at it. But take care. I hope you enjoyed this video. Give me a thumbs up, leave me a comment, and hopefully you'll feel I'm worth subscribing to. I would appreciate a subscription, and more so a thumbs up. Neither one costs you anything. So take care. Have a good one.